the top of it.
Yeah. Okay,
Let's
well,
see if I can hide that. Hide floating meeting controls. Boom.
there we go. All right. All right, so cellist Glendenning, she was noticing that there is a big difference between what she perceived our modern civilized way of looking at the world is and what tribal people that she studied, a few tribes, were doing. And this is the quote: "The goal of development, according to psychology," huge oversimplification, but bear with her, "is to create boundaries, to encase things, the encapsulated individual. To a nature-based person, individual consciousness does not exist. The unit of wholeness is the universe, soul of the world." And another quote is, "If a Kung has a problem, it is not their problem, it is a sign of the problem in the community or the cosmos." So now I want to say I don't ascribe to either of these views, that either the individual focused or the cosmos focused, or even the tribe focused. I'm going to present something here that's going to be maybe a bridge between these two. Oh, this is terrible. Yeah, maybe. So first, yeah, I want to talk about some criteria for success. I mean, we don't have to have criteria for success. We can just say whatever is. But I guess as Western scientists, we like to have measurable goals. And so the purpose is to be able to improve. And if you can measure it, you can perhaps do better next time. So I have these arbitrary criteria, but I think they can help make things better. So the first is longevity, and I arbitrarily said greater than 3 generations. So if you have a community that only lasts for 1 generation, it doesn't make the cut here. And the second one was also a high bar. If a community doesn't keep at least 90% of its members, then it doesn't cut it. The third one seems fuzzy, but it actually isn't. There are ways to measure happiness. And sociologists and psychologists do it. I just want to say that if a community can have its members happier than outside the community in the average mainstream world, then that's a success. And the last one is that it's sort of a political thing. Like a lot of people who, not all, but a lot of people who are interested in intentional communities don't just want to do it for themselves. They want to make an impact in the world. So the last criterion is about that. If you can replicate the community at least 10 times. And with these high bars, it's actually true that almost no communities that exist today pass them. There's a few Hutterites and Bruderhof and monastery communities that do pass them, and we'll talk later about what's special about them. And the other, can anybody read this at all? Are you guys able to read this?
No, not the bottom.
Not the bottom one. So, yeah, I can. I guess I can read it on here. But so there's kind of a secret in the intentional communities world that so far only a handful of religious communities are debatably able to pass all 4 criteria. Diane Christian wrote a book called Making a Life Together, and she gave the 90% failure rate statistic just for how many communities are actually are able to get started. So only about 10% make it off the ground, and most of the rest fail after starting. So that's pretty dismal if you have these stringent criteria. If you could say, well, if it lasts a year and people had a great time, that's okay too. And certainly there are people who would say that something like Burning Man is great, but Burning Man actually has been going on for a while. So we'll see how long it can keep going. So I'm going to take a detour here and talk about something that biologists have learned about in the past, I don't know, 50 years maybe, but it hasn't quite made it into mainstream consciousness. When people think about Darwinian evolution, they usually think about individuals who are competing against each other. But what biologists have learned is that there's actually all these levels of organization, starting with DNA, then DNA networks, and then there's cells, and then, or even below that, organelles, and then there's multicellular organisms, and so on. You know, these organisms could form collaborative groups, and humans, we'll talk about humans next, also do this. And in order to call something an individual, at each one of these levels, a few of these other criteria have to hold. One is that there has to be boundaries of some sort. So, you know, a cell has boundaries, a multicellular organism has boundaries, a village has boundaries. And the next criterion is that there has to be a way to identify the individual self from what is not self. And actually here I have a picture of the immune system. The immune system does this. How it does this is very complicated. The next criterion after that is that there has to be some sort of punishing, which sounds harsh, but it just means that there's a cost to parts that that exhibit what is called free riding behavior. And what that means, I'll talk more about it later, but for now, let's just say free riding means that these parts are not contributing as much as the other parts that are not free riding. It can also mean that instead of looking out for the good of the whole, they're looking out for their own best interests instead of the organism of which they're a part interest. This is not a bad thing, but it's not necessarily in the interest. It's damaging to the higher level organism to have this sort of behavior, usually, not always. So here, this is not showing, I don't know why, but this is supposed to be like a cartoon of all these pupils or maybe a nurse. And this is like a cancer cell, and these are normal cells. And I guess the nurse is going to kick the cancer cell out. So cancer is an example of free riding in multicellular organism, and there has to be ways of punishing cancer cells somehow. The next criterion after that is that there has to be ways to help the needs of the parts be congruent with the needs of the whole without subsuming the parts. So all these different cell types, for example, have to somehow cooperate, and their own needs can't be that different from the needs of the multicellular organism. So that has to happen in order for the multicellular organism to be called an individual. The next criterion is to minimize competition and conflict at the lower level. So, for example, symbiosis. There is also something called endosymbiosis, where one cell type can engulf another, but instead of killing it, they now cooperate. So the higher level organism, which is the two cell types in this case, has to make sure that their needs are not too different than the needs of the whole. Specialization is another way of reducing conflict. And finally, if all these things happen, the current level will be competitive with other entities with other entities that the current level is not a co-part in a higher level with. That's a mouthful. Just think about a bunch of rowers that are all. This is not focused, I think, is it?
It's about as good as
This is, but it, yeah. But these are all rowers and crew boats, and they don't want to. The crew boats are trying to compete with each other, but they don't want to have competition within the crew boat. That's just going to reduce the effectiveness of each crew boat. So they want to be competitive with other crew boats, entities that the current level is not a co-part. There's nothing higher than the crew boat in this example that is an organism. So they're competing against other crew boats, but they don't want too much competition in the crew boat itself. And Darwinian evolution happens at all levels, actually. We still have survival of the fittest, but it's not just the gene or the multicellular organism. So all levels where individuality exists, actually. Okay, ignore the lower part here. I don't really want to talk about that. It's more complicated than what I said. So how is this relevant to humans? That's what we really want to know. And humans also have these different levels of individuality, if you want to say that, levels of organization that have individuality. There's the actual thing that we call an individual, a human being, and then there's above that there's usually a family. Above that there's a tribe, a village, nowadays a company perhaps. Above that there's a city, and above that it could be a nation or a state. And at each one of these levels, different characteristics are more important than others. And just a sort of representation of that is, for example, if you talk about freedom, DNA molecule doesn't care much about freedom. An organelle doesn't care, maybe a little more. A cell might need a little bit of freedom. A human being is where the sweet spot in freedom is, and then family needs some freedom, the tribe needs maybe some freedom. By the time you get to a nation, not that much. It's not something a nation experiences. Something like bureaucracy. So these are all traits that are different at different levels, and something like a tribe actually has a sort of intermediate level of bureaucracy. Doesn't have that much bureaucracy, actually. A nation has more, something above nations have even more than that. And I'm going to talk about the global economy, which is something that has arisen lately. And I think the global economy, despite all its advantages, is actually something that's not so good for tribes and villages and maybe even families. I'm going to say more about that in a minute. But it's important to realize that the global economy is not, maybe yet, an organism or an individual. So it doesn't need to minimize competition between companies, cities, nations. Also, this will become important in a minute. the villages and tribes are not psychologically replaceable by companies, cities, and nations. It's probably due to some human cognitive limitation. There was I think, was he a sociologist or anthropologist by the name of Dunbar, which figured like the optimal human group has about 150, the optimal human tribe has about 150 people. If you go above that, human beings can't keep track anymore. So they can only be close to no more than that many people, about 150 roughly. So villages, tribes have already been mostly outcompeted since the global economy has started. They just haven't been able to compete with it. But and I would also claim that families are in the process of being made not as relevant. So this is now the situation. You have these nested levels of human organization, and now you have a global economy with corporations, which are now mediating between the global economy and individuals. And the first thing that goes is that tribes, villages, and companies are no longer connected to cities. Then after that, they're no longer connected to families. And we haven't quite gotten there yet, but at some point, it's possible that families will also lose their connection and relevance. And so without appropriate supports, tribes, villages, and families disappear. And without families, tribes, and villages, humans probably can't thrive. There's some data on the importance of these by Jonathan Haidt. So if the global economy had been an individual, an organism, this wouldn't happen, right? It would try to like keep all these lower levels intact and not compete against them. The second thing that has happened with the global economy is that, oops, did I do something? How do I get rid of it? Okay. Should I click down below? I'm afraid that if I click on it.
Go click on the unit.
But I don't even see my mouse. Where? See if you can find it.
Yeah, it doesn't really show the mouse, does it?
I don't know what I'm. There we go. Somewhere. Oh, there's.
Yeah, there's no mouse.
So escape and go back into it.
Yeah.
No. Thanks. Okay. So the other thing that has happened is that we've also, because of the global economy, we've also lost our connection to place and the nature around us. And now we have virtual reality too to make that even worse. So, what's that? No, you can ask now. I might say that I'll answer it shortly, but go ahead.
How is the global economy deterred us from having us lose our connection
To place? Well, I mean, it's not a linear thing because there were our ancestors were mostly nomadic, and we'll talk more about that. But they were nomadic and still had a connection to where they are. So now, because we are not dependent on the nature around us for our food, we go to the store. that's basically the answer. If we are not dependent on it, we're dependent on the store or something far away. Just like if you're not dependent on the villagers or tribes people around you, you kind of lose that entity, that connection. A village or a tribe.
That's probably the key word is dependence upon also.
Yeah.
If I can live in this kind of hyper-autonomous way
Right.
without any awareness of other natural.
Well, you do have awareness, but the awareness is not of the nature around you or the people around you as much as, you know, the people somewhere else. Yeah.
The global economy has allowed me to have this ease of not needing other people.
Right. And the reason this has happened, it sounds like just a negative thing, is because it's not just a negative thing. There's advantages of the global economy. And I summarized some of them. It can promote intergroup tolerance. This is actually, you know, the humanist revolution that has happened since the Enlightenment between nations and cultures, now more than ever through communication and travel. It's created abundance, like more efficient ways of using resources in some cases. And for some people, not for everybody. I guess some people are still not doing so great. And it allows for many people to have time to create art or science and things that are not directly related to survival. And it also creates many employment opportunities. So it used to be most of the population was farming. Now there's so many other things people can do. So just know that I'm not a fanatic about this, but what I'm saying is that there are advantages, but the disadvantages are that it's basically made tribes and villages not as able to compete as before the global economy. With the global economy.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So survive. Okay.
Yeah.
Survive.
All right. So I'm going to lead to some principles that are helpful for intentional communities. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about some things that can happen when you have an organism or an intentional community or nation that are not good and should be avoided if you want an intentional community to keep going and be successful. So one of these things is what I call subsuming from above. And I'll start with a quote from this biologist called Edward Wilson, E.O. Wilson. He was an entomologist. He studied mostly ants. And he realized that Karl Marx was right, that socialism actually works. It's just that he had the wrong species. It's kind of a joke statement. Humans are too diverse for something like socialism to work. There's so many needs that people have. And but what can happen is in a cult is that the individuals are somehow subsumed by the need of the collective. And this would work for ants or bees, but it doesn't work very well for humans. There's something about the human spirit that doesn't allow that to happen. So that's something to watch out for in a community. So yeah.
Sure. Say that
No, I wouldn't say that. Just for I think it can definitely happen in other things too. That
I mean that there has been collectivist cultures that have survived with that kind of ethos, whether it's a long-term communist Chinese culture,
Where is it?
whether or not they can
yeah,
survive,
I don't know.
whether
I
or not
don't
they
know. Yeah.
psychologically survive very well.
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. I
dans
A lot
l'ordinaire.
of us survive out of force also, right? So,
Right.
They have
They may
positive
not pass the happiness test.
That's it, that's it right there. That's it. That's exactly right.
So even though they can survive as a totalitarian regime, perhaps they're like, do we really want that?
But the measures of success have to be kept in mind if we work for this.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. The other thing that can happen as an example of this is if a family, or not just individuals, but families can also be subsumed. Like some communities just don't want families. There have been examples of that, and they don't do very well either. The other general kind of thing that can happen is what I've called invading from below, where cancer is the standard kind of example of this. But in human groups, it's called free riding. So this can happen in so many intentional communities where some people are not perceived or even are not contributing as much as everybody else. And it's a spectrum, you know, you can't say if this is free riding and this is not, there's more or less of this that can happen. It's not necessarily a problem if it only happens occasionally or with a few individuals, but if at some point nobody's contributing, then the group can't survive anymore. And certain conditions encourage this kind of free riding, and other conditions discourage it. And Austrian principles are something that we'll see discourage free riding. Also, the other thing of subsuming from above is discouraged by Austrian principles. So let's see, the history of this is that before Eleanor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize in economics, there was this problem which has been called the tragedy of the commons, which is if there is some kind of common pool resource, short CPR, then like a pasture, and every individual can bring their cows to the pasture, then most likely what will happen if there's no Austrian principles is that everybody will bring as many cows as possible, and the pasture will just get denuded of grass. So there has to be some kind of restrictions on how that works out. The other thing that can happen is instead of having this common pool resource, before Ostrom, people thought there were only two solutions: total privatization, everybody has their own private pasture, and then they're going to make sure that it's not denuded, right? Or socialism. Basically, there's some bigger entity that says these are the rules. And what Ostrom figured out is that there's a third option, which is people can self-organize in small groups, and as long as they follow what these 8 principles that she extracted, then you won't get the tragedy of the commons. So, what's that? Oh, okay. Should I keep going? Or?
Yeah, just keep going, please.
Okay. So, yeah.
Okay.
So it turns out that Austrian principles deal not just with that problem, but with the other problem of being subsumed or from above or outcompeted, which are slightly different actually. Subsumed is when you have a higher entity, individual. Outcompeted.
Did I miss the definition or example?
We haven't gotten to the Austrian principles yet.
Okay.
I'm
Really
leading up
important.
to it. This is all.
Really
This is all
important.
yeah, this is leading up to the Austrian principles. So, and I want to say that the common pool resource can also be can also be what the individuals are providing goods and services, for example, could be a common pool resource. I can use that. Yeah, Austrian
D'habitude, je raccroche, puis peut-être.
class problems being succeeded or repeated and free riding.
It's frozen.
Je veux dire, can you let Manu in?
Can I need some, okay?
Yes. Yes, that's a good question. I mean, the global economy allows us to use such things. It's great, but that doesn't mean that the global economy doesn't cause problems. We can have something that causes us to be able to explain certain things, such as this projector, and at the same time, destruction of villages and tribes and perhaps families. These two are not incompatible.
Sorry, just had a...
They're only incompatible for extremists who want to focus on all the good or all the bad, right? But
Est-ce que je peux passer, moi?
so
Ça dit invite.
okay.
So we have two people still in the waiting room. Are we not able to? Let
Were
them in?
there?
Two people that did the waiting room. I just didn't know. It's maybe not the most important thing, but it does.
Ils savent, là. Ils disent.
Let me see if I can add them in.
Yeah.
Huh?
See that blue is it, but-
Yeah. You know what? It kind of freezes up. It's weird.
Oh, yeah. Let's do the recording. And I just say admit all. Or admit, yeah.
It's so weird. I can't see my mouse. It's like all...
That's the problem.
Oh, we should just tell them.
Okay. We don't have to keep doing this.
Yeah,
I'm not going that.
I can't click anywhere. It's like all...
We'll send them the recording.
So let me do this again. Let's see.
Okay, we'll send you the recording.
Can you contact them to
Okay.
just let them know we're having trouble? And they can, I mean, I would love for them to be around and ask questions. But,
They are coming in 40 minutes.
yeah.
Tu as écrit quelque chose à eux?
Yeah, this is the free rider.
Right.
Est-ce que je leur ai écrit quelque chose?
No, the punishment thing sounds harsh, but it just means imposing some kind of cost, right? It doesn't have to be actual punishment, like the stockade. Like it could also be like a rehabilitation kind of thing. And also, just to insert another kind of wrench into this monkey wrench, that there's actually beneficial things for free riders too. Like, it turns out that germ cells like sperm and eggs can actually be considered as free riding. Because most of them don't do anything. There's only like 2 that maybe produce an organism out of the millions of sperm and a lot of eggs. So and then they just sit around and get fed and like they don't really contribute except maybe a little bit at the end. But they're very beneficial. So the world is complicated. Yeah, perhaps. And that with humans, you could say the same thing. There's these people who like are crazy scientists who nobody, or artists, and they seem to like not contribute, but they do maybe sometimes. So it's not simple. But like Michael Jackson. Yes. Okay. Is it actually advancing?
Oh, I think it is. It's just
It's
animation.
just slow. Yeah, the animation. That one is There's probably a way to go to the next slide, but I don't remember the
Okay,
shortcut.
so
Okay, you got
I
it.
thought it was stuck, but it was the animation.
Okay.
Were we on?
There we go. The Austrian Principles. Okay.
This one. Okay.
Awesome.
This was like a Nobel Prize winning idea.
Yeah, I mean, what Ostrom did is she studied a bunch of let's say, groups that had a common pool resource, and she looked at a bunch that survived and a bunch that didn't. And she was able to extract all these principles. So these are kind of like high-level principles. The way they're implemented are very different in different groups. So the thing that's really amazing is that most of these I already talked about in the biology section. And people noticed that later. She did not even know about the biology stuff, I don't think. She didn't say in the paper. But later on, it was noticed that, yeah, nature already does this.
So Ostrom kind of pulled multi-level selection into this intentional.
But she didn't know about multi-level selection.
No,
All she knew is that these are the things that make groups work, that groups with common pool resources,
That's
at
fascinating.
least, yeah. Anyway, so these guys, well, later, you know, she collaborated with David Wilson and Michael Cox, and they figured out, yeah, nature already does this. And then, yeah, anyway, some other groups expounded on it. So I don't think these are the original principles. Actually, these are a little refined. But basically, I'll just run through them. Stop me if you have a question. So the first one is the group that wants to succeed has to have some boundaries that say which are the legitimate users and users. It sounds terrible, but we're talking about a resource that's being shared. So you know, tribal people may not look at this way. They look at things more in terms of relationships than of resources. But Ostrom also has a bunch of stuff to say about relationships. Yeah, if you have a community, you want to know who's a member of the community and who's not a member of the community. It's useful to know that. Also, it's useful to know what the shared resource is and have a boundary around that. The second one is congruence with local conditions. I mean, it's, you know, a lot of Western hubris is we come somewhere and we think we know everything and we just want to take the resource. But if you want a group that is doing that to survive, you can't do that. You have to make sure that you're congruent with the local.
I don't understand what that means.
So I have an example. Like if we have let's say you buy a property and it's been the custom that people are hunting on that land, you want to like continue that. You don't want to say, oh no more hunters. That's going to create problems with your neighbors. Or if you are going, I don't know, if you're going somewhere and just starting a mining operation and you just trash all the rivers, and that's not good. Okay.
So there's an assumption that the local users have already adopted conservation.
Yes, something that's made them survive to this point.
Oh, it's more just like making sure that it's whatever thing that you're doing or whatever resource you're using is sustainable.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So you want to continue to survive. This 2B is really important. That's basically what I call the fairness or justice principle. And it's just that there's proportional costs and benefits, and if you have someone that's getting a lot more benefits than they're putting in costs in whatever form, then that's free riding behavior, and the community needs to have a way of dealing with that. but basically they try to keep the ratio of cost or benefit to cost whatever cost benefit roughly equal for all the people who are in the community or group. The third is more something about democracy or consensus, that if you want your community to not build up resentment, you have to have people involved in decision making if they're affected by those decisions. This is actually not true for like non-human. I mean, maybe some non-human groups do this, but others have all sorts of hierarchies where some members don't have a say at all. Maybe just like one alpha male or one brain that, anyway.
Or a religious community, a long-term religious community.
Some religious communities, not all. Usually they have like a bunch of elders, but yes, people still, in most successful religious communities, they still have a say. It's not like you can't continue something where a large percentage of the population doesn't have a say in how things are run. But I mean, sometimes you can have things like a small group that doesn't have a say. Like sometimes children may not have that much of a say in some societies, at least with big decisions.
Not to go too far afield here, but I'm struck by the discrepancy between your original introduction that the most predominant example of long-term successful communities are these religious communities.
That's right.
Which very clearly do not have this democratic view. And so this democratic consensus.
Well, they don't have it. So I shouldn't have called it democratic. It just matters that there is some say. You just have to have some say in the decision making.
And this is part of Austrian Principles, right?
Yes. Yes. Orville is what?
Has everyone has a say?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, most modern intentional communities definitely have this, but I mean that's not why they fail. It's not because they're violating this one. They might be violating other ones, like the 2B is often violated. There's not this understanding of proportional costs and benefits sometimes. And it could be violated by like a guru sometimes, someone who just takes advantage of their power or charisma, not just anybody necessarily. Okay, so moving on. There has to be some way of monitoring community members. And it could be that everyone is monitoring, or it could be just a small group. It could be outsiders that are outsourced to do that. It doesn't matter as long as there's some kind of monitoring going on. Make sure that people are keeping agreements. And so it breaks down into monitoring community members and monitoring the resource. Make sure nobody is getting more than their fair share. Or depleting the resource, like they're not using good practices, sustainable practices. The fifth principle is that if someone does break agreements, don't just kick them out immediately unless the thing they did is so horrendous that it requires that. So graduated sanctions, the punishment has to be proportional to the strength of the breach of agreement. Of course, you probably know that we also need conflict resolution mechanisms. I added N reduction. This was just my own addition. Austrian did not say this, but I also observed, and knowing from what nature does, it's important to not have too much incentive for people within your community to be competing too much with each other. I mean, they can do so friendly competition sports, but if they're really, competing for resources, it's not good for the community. So you have to have some kind of agreement about how you resolve conflict, and that could be something like NBC or restorative justice circles, or could be like someone who's the judge who decides. It doesn't matter. Just everybody has to agree to some conflict resolution mechanism. The seventh is, and you know, there is stuff like that in biology as well. So let's see. The seventh is that you want. So these first six principles are more about internal stuff like free riding and not depleting resource. The seventh and eighth are more about higher levels and not being subsumed by higher levels. So the seventh is you need minimal recognition of rights to organize. You don't want to break the laws of the nation you're in. For example, if you're in an intentional community, you decide that you're, I don't know, just into heroin or something. Most countries have laws against that. You're going to get in trouble. You want to make sure you are not violating the laws of the greater nation. And number 8 is that what has been called subsidiarity, that the nested levels, let's say community and state, for example, do not conflict or compete with each other. For intentional communities in the US, there's something called the Federation of Intentional Communities, the FIC. That's like a higher level of organization. And yeah, if they want to be part of the FIC, which has some advantages like insurance, they have to abide by the agreements of the FIC. And what you don't want to happen is that the FIC now is controlling their day-to-day life. That would be like subsuming from above. So if you do these things, you should do pretty well. It's not the only things that you have to do as an intentional community. Another thing that intentional communities sometimes do that doesn't help them is they confuse the organizational level of family with the organizational level of tribe or village or community, because an intentional community is a sort of a tribe or a village. So let's see.
Can we go back to that, or just pause for a second?
Yeah.
Have you found that there are communities that have like formalized those principles into some kind of like?
Which one's the Austrian Principles?
Yeah, the Austrian Principles.
The only one that I know that has done that is Dancing Rabbit. Yeah, because they have some nerds among them who are into this stuff. And David Sloan Wilson actually went there, gave a talk, and he had a graduate student, I think, who did some work there also. Well, actually, the graduate student did a lot of work in a lot of communities, but I think Dancing Rabbit was particularly sympathetic. But yeah, a lot of communities might do all of them or some of them, and the groups that Ostrom studied, they didn't know about Austrian Principles, right? They just did it. The ones that were successful just did these things, and so yeah, there's communities that do it without knowing that they're doing it.
So it can be both descriptive and prescriptive, really. Like you can say, I found this and described it, or it's something we should implement.
Yes, that's true.
So most of the groups kind of have come to this, has come to this as like an organic process and not like somebody.
If they survived, yes, they probably came to it. If they didn't survive, they might have missed one of the Austrian Principles, or sometimes they do this, which, let's see, how can I explain this? Due to love, trust, and gift economy, which are most appropriate at the family level, some Austrian principles happen naturally, others are not even needed. But they are needed at this higher level of tribe, village, intentional community. And if you don't know that, you might get in trouble. Like one thing that can happen is that if you're sharing domestic space with strangers without enough love or trust, or expecting villagers to operate with total love and trust and experiencing free riding, then you might experience free riding for lack of explicit Austrian principles. Now,
Important point, that like,
yeah,
that didn't quite hit me until you really put it into consciousness of why it's not.
right. Yeah, I mean, there's just a difference. Like, there's different things that are appropriate at each of these levels. So if you confuse them, you're going to get in trouble. So like, there's communes that say, we don't need all these complicated rules, because they want to operate like a family. They just want to love and trust and have good vibes. But that works at the family level, but it doesn't really work at the community level.
But if it's individuals, that can be a different kind of vibe that can actually work with the right people. But I think once you put a bunch of families together, it's different. Because you're having organizations.
Maybe that is a good point. Yeah.
How
If you, but even like a bunch of individuals, I think there's a limit of scale also. Like, how many people can you have in a family? How many adults, let's say? I don't think it's that many. Like, and a lot of communities think, oh yeah, we have like 50 adults. Let's just be a family, and usually that doesn't work. They need Austrian principles. They need other things.
Well, it's a good example, like you'll stay up all night with your own child, but if somebody else's child is keeping you up all night every night, you might start to think, okay, it's the child.
Right, unless you're able to somehow merge your families, right?
Yeah.
But yeah. Okay. So yeah, I guess that was sort of anyway, that whole thing could be looked at as the last two Austrian principles, but we don't have to do that. It could be like a separate thing, this whole thing about tribes and families. So the other thing is to notice is that these Austrian principles are easier to implement for smaller groups. Like when you get to like big groups, it's harder to do certain things. Like if we have let's say, a lot of corporations have their private land that they might have bought, or a lot of things are privatized, but there's still common pool resources. For example, the atmosphere or some like the oceans where waste goes. And if you don't have clear boundaries of where that happens, you can have trouble. I guess so these are sometimes violated. All these things are sometimes violated by international corporations that are trying to use the atmosphere as a dumping ground, for example, or carbon or pollution into rivers. These are just, I'm listing a bunch of Austrian principles that are being violated. We don't have to go into them. And I'm not saying all companies do this, but there have been examples. And there was a book by this guy, John Perkins, who detailed some of these things. So another result of the global economy is that so far we have ineffective global feedbacks. Like we do things that have a negative impact on the atmosphere and the climate, and we don't always see the connection between what we do and the impact, because there's many other people and it takes time, and sometimes the impact is somewhere else. So That's why I call these feedbacks rather ineffective. And if you're in a local kind of economy, then it's harder for this to happen. If you mess up, you're going to get feedback pretty quickly, and it comes to you, not to somebody else. If you overgraze your pasture or exploit your forest for timber, you're going to pay for it pretty quickly. If you're dealing in a local economy, the feedbacks are much more immediate and effective. I just had this kind of idea, which I don't know, it's not that original, because I think this was mostly the way things were done before the Industrial Revolution, and maybe now we can adapt it. That what if we actually did have a local economy, and what if it was structured in such a way that these Austrian principles would either naturally occur or that things were more privatized, but local. So I called it a community-supported community, and it's just an extension of the community-supported agriculture that has been successful in several places. And yeah, I don't know if people can wrap their minds about this, but people used to do this basically like in a village or a tribe. The people in those organizations would basically provide most of their needs for each other. Sure, there'd be a little bit of trade and you know, and then they would travel sometimes, but mostly once they were in a place, they could get most of their basic needs from that place. I'm not saying we have to do it the same way as those people did. Maybe we could innovate and do things differently, but I think that's a good idea for actually keeping a community interdependent and keeping a connection to the land.
May I ask something just to see if I understand it correctly?
Sure.
So would it be right to think of it like maybe there were these interdependent local communities and something like industrialization comes on board and that bigger nest is now competing?
Yes.
So it's sucking people into urban life.
Right. That's
so that's
right.
the competition in the nest that kind of starts to disrupt the system.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the first to observe this. Like, I was reading a book by this guy Kumarappa, who was Gandhi's economist in the 1930s, and he was going to all these Indian villages, and they were complaining, well, people are leaving for the cities, and the young people are not here, and it's becoming not a fun place to live. And like Kumarappa was noticing that the guy who was telling him this had a rug in his house from Liverpool. At the time, Liverpool was you know, a hub of textiles, and he was like, "Why? You know, we have our own Indian production, but they couldn't compete with the factories in Liverpool because the Indian production was all handicraft." Anyway, and eventually it moved from Liverpool to the Third World. Back to India, perhaps, I'm not sure. Maybe not so much textiles, I don't know. But anyway, so this is just one idea that I thought maybe people could do that. It has a lot of advantages as far as like built-in Austrian principles, and it doesn't even have to be like that the goods and services are common pool resources. It could be that they're private until they're exchanged. But the main thing is the locality is kind of built in, and there's also, instead of having everybody doing the same thing, it's like there's specialization, and that's like a conflict reduction mechanism also. And also there, yeah, okay, that's enough about that. Yeah.
Who support this agreement? I mean, how is this different for a given community than that given community just being self-sufficient?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one?
What is the support that the community is getting from other similar communities?
What is the support that the community who is doing this is getting from other?
Community supported community.
Oh,
Sounds
oh.
like it's like
Oh,
communities
no.
supporting each other.
Yeah, no, the people in the community are supporting each other. That's what I mean. Instead of,
Not a separate community.
no, yeah. I mean, that could happen too at some point, but this is just about, yeah, people in the community, all inputs and outputs are all within the community. This could be on a scale of thousands of people. It probably won't work with just like 100 people even.
If we're all in our rowboats and we're kind of not competing with each other and we're doing a great job, is it necessary that we are competing with another community? Or is that just sort of
I don't,
the other rowboats?
that's a good question. Like, I don't know if we have to do Darwinian evolution. In biology, yes, competition is actually the engine that drives improvement. But it can happen. Yes, but it happens at mostly at the higher level. Like, I guess you can have lower level stuff that's competing, but usually that destroys the higher level.
But they're doing Austrian Principles better, I'm gonna go live over there.
Yeah, exactly. That is so like communities are actually could be competing with each other, not necessarily for resources, but for the hearts and minds of others.
Are you,
We want
are you
our
seeing these groups as these communities as static, or like the membership kind of changes?
Yeah, it could, of course, people could go from one community to another. I don't really want to advocate necessarily to have competition, but it could be a good thing, right, for improving things.
But if we wanted to say we're a great community, we really want this teacher, we want teachers who want to live here. It seems like that's where competition could drive improvement. But am I now
Competition
stepping-
with other
Is
communities,
that,
yeah.
am I now stepping into the
No,
slippery
it's
slope of global
no, I think.
economy?
Say again. Yeah, you
Am I
said
now stepping into that slippery slope of global economy? Is that just kind of?
not necessarily. I think they could still stay, at a local level. I mean, each community is doing their thing, but of course there is a world out there, and people could choose which one. And
You can almost see how we become stagnant if you didn't have it.
yes.
Like
Yes,
I could just.
possibly. Although, so I've been having this argument with this one guy who just hates competition, and I'm like, well, it has its advantages, but he says, well, we are not these Darwinian creatures that just do random things. We have foresight and we have memory, and so we can actually cooperate. Why do we need to compete with these other communities? Why can't we cooperate with them? I don't know. I don't have the answer.
But more respect is not a black white idea, like one's good, one's good.
Right.
One's bad.
Yeah.
Maybe some are.
Right. Yeah. Sure. Here's one other. This is so terrible. You can't really see anything, but others. Okay. Just have to get that. This is a little sweet. But, okay. So this is something that you asked about, Jennifer, and yeah, they're not totally democratic, but they still follow Austrian principles, but they also do some other things. They seem to have a respect for authority, and liberal communities sometimes, like for good reasons, may not have that respect for authority. Now, authority has gotten like a total bad rap because sometimes it's abused. Sometimes there's gurus who do all kinds of things to their disciples and abuse their power. But it can also be really useful to have people who are just really great at something, and so they might have more say about the thing that they're great at than anybody else in the community, or and so like liberal communities might not like to have people who are really good at something and have more power. They might say, no, you should somehow bring them down, or people who have leadership abilities sometimes are brought down in liberal communities, which I don't think is a good thing, but I understand the motives for it.
That goes back to your diversity ants thing, right?
Right. Well, I think we can't all be the same, right? So some people are going to be better, and we should, if we were smart, we would make use of that instead of just like flattening everything. Yeah. The other thing that religious or conservative community, you might think, oh, it's just a religion, but it's not just a religion. There's these particular things that they do. The other thing is that they have a sense of the sacred, which is a big unifying principle. If you don't have that, you're not doing as well. I mean, it just helps them. This is just a graph of how long a bunch of communities lasted. I think it's actually, if I remember correctly, this is mostly from the 19th century, but I could be remembering wrong. It could also be data from the 20th century. So you see the religious ones, the top curve, last longer than the secular ones. So yeah, the sense of the sacred, sometimes that's expressed in what sociologists call high-cost rituals, where it's like clear that people are not faking it, that it costs them a lot, you know, like they'll stay up all night or they'll puke or something. They can't, that's not something that's easily fakeable. You know what I'm talking about. Okay, so then the other thing that conservative communities do really well, and usually better than more liberal communities, is loyalty. They have a real sense of loyalty to each other. Now, by the way, I'm not. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a conservative. I'm like a super liberal person. I'm so liberal that I think I can be humble and learn something from conservatives. The other thing, there's other mechanisms that they have. Sometimes they share it with more liberal communities, like this idea that people should do some inner work. That it's not helpful to always blame other people. That's something that is good for a community to have that. And conservative communities typically do have that.
A demand for inner exploration rather than external blame.
Yes.
That's
Conservatives, yeah, I think so. Like at least, I mean, yeah, that's part of Christianity actually. But liberal communities can do this as well. And I think liberal communities can do all of these if they just like thought about it and paid attention. I think all of them can be done. I'm not advocating for unearned authority or just like someone being a guru and not based on anything except they're charismatic. I'm just saying, like, let people be different and excel and make that serve the community. Okay, so that's that. And I guess this is like a summary of all the things we've talked about. In order to create interdependence and coherence between people and between people and nature, which seem to be essential for human happiness. That's from this work by Jonathan Haidt. He wrote about it in his book, The Happiness Hypothesis. You want to minimize competition from higher levels of organization, like cities, nations, and the global economy. You want to distinguish between family and community, create boundaries around family and community. You want to become more open to earned authority, agree on what's sacred, and feel belonging and loyalty through ritual, cultural activities, inner work, and perhaps this other idea of community-supported community. And in order to avoid free riding of all sorts, follow Austrian principles. So that's basically it. I wanted to say just a little bit more about something that this community is, and there's a bunch of transient IC and intentional communities. So, you know, I said in the beginning that we have a long history of nomadism and desire to explore other places, and I think the world schooling community is tapping into that. But I think there might be some downsides. So like there might, if people are not with each other enough time, there might not be enough time to develop trust and loyalty if people are leaving constantly, unless maybe they're traveling together or they get together every year, like which I think people here are trying to do. So maybe that's okay. Also, there may not be time if you're constantly traveling to become competent at projects that benefit the community. Maybe unless the projects can be brought along. But I'm thinking more traditionally about craftspeople who, you know, are pretty much place-based. I mean, the gypsies had certain things that they could bring with them, like they were tinkers and could fix pots and pans and stuff like that. And of course, they played music. So they brought their instruments. And also in a transient community, you gotta watch out for not being able to form bonds with the land. I think that's a really good thing to unify people also, to have this land that they can steward. And I think original Paleolithic nomads would return to places. So that could be an issue. Also, the other thing is that is somewhat special about this sort of community is people pay to be there. And that's not a problem in itself. There's a big market for it, and it's kind of congruent with the global economy, even though I said the global economy is not too congruent with tribes and villages and maybe intentional communities. But in this case, maybe it is.
It's kind of full circle in a way. The global economy is coming back around and offering this thing that we've realized was lost.
Right.
And then maybe we do sort of.
Perhaps, yeah. But the problem that I still have with this is that me and other people in the intentional community movement, as I said in the beginning, we don't just think of this as like a way for us to have a good life. We want to think about it as a bigger thing that is going to make an impact on life on this planet, maybe just human life, but probably not just human life. And so if it's only available to a few privileged people, that doesn't solve that problem. It's great for those people, but what about everybody else? It can't have too much impact if only a small percentage of the people can participate in it.
Is this where competition comes in? That we're competing with that? I mean, like I think all of us experience that people are looking at our Facebook or Instagram and saying, "Oh my God, what are you doing? I want to do that."
Yeah.
Is that competition?
Yeah, sure, but still, how many? I think it's like still too expensive for most people to be able to afford to live this way.
Was there an element of equity in this model that we talked about? Like, is that a principle that happiness and these benefits are distributed equally, or
no? Only if you want to form a higher organism. So if you want the whole globe to be an organism, but I wasn't going there. I was just saying this is like a personal thing for me and a few other people. Yeah, I think.
But this is like the conundrum, right? I mean, you said that it's intentional communities are really hard to scale up because then you lose some of those.
That's right.
Austrian Principles.
Yes,
But
it's
then
harder
if
to
we keep
implement.
them small, it's always going to be only available to like the privileged few.
Well, not necessarily. Not necessarily. If you have like a size of a few thousand people that could actually create a local economy in certain places, maybe not everywhere, there's enough resources. I think it could be available to almost anybody. Like Oroville, for example. Don't quote. But yeah, anyway, Oroville is work in progress. Is, where they're headed. But yeah, Oroville might be heading this way.
I mean, I
Sure.
think like the critique of this being a high price point privileged view doesn't necessarily mean we're static at that.
Right.
Developmental
Absolutely,
stage.
absolutely. I said, maybe ICs which create intentional communities which create these alternatives could go viral and be available to the majority of the people.
Oh, okay.
But maybe they could be started by, a relatively wealthy minority like us.
Right.
So, sure.
Yeah, and also taking consideration the difference of economies, so like these communities, Muslim communities are going to developing countries, take advantage of this difference in economy, people coming from the West, So if that was to go viral and happen enough, it's redistribution of wealth, and then the following Austrian principles, they aren't, it's to go towards them, that's at least hopefully a sustainable way. And then B, if it's through the world story, when they're picking up information that we don't have in the West and redistributing that back, to the people who run the global economy. So it's starting to spread.
I mean, like cultural stuff, for
Yeah,
example. Yeah.
stuff, like indigenous.
Yeah, yeah.
Knowledge.
Mhm.
It's like a de-urbanization. It's going against industrialization, moving away from economic industrial centers.
Because we are from there and have the wealth to do that.
Yeah.
I don't see that. I still think that we're basically, using the global economy, and that's fine, but I would like to get to a point where we're not as dependent on it, at least for basic needs. And
But I feel like if there's two viewpoints that you sit from, which is where we are now, which is frustrating. And then there's this if we had it as more of a developmental model, like, well, yeah, we still are dependent on the global economy, and you need thousands of dollars to do this. And then we can say, yeah, but that, right?
well, but it's not just distributing money and culture. It's like at some point we need to start producing what we're eating and like what we're
But
using.
we need to do that today in order for it to be a critique. We're moving toward that, maybe.
Maybe I don't know. Are we?
The organism might be.
Yeah.
Is it that the degree of interdependence is what creates, these benefits? I mean, is there a model where a hybrid, where for example, we depend on the global economy, and I think of like Amazon, right? Where it's like Amazon is the answer for all of our goods, but then we depend on one another for other things like social benefits and other things like that, and then there's a symbiosis between that. Like, is that possible, you think, or does it have to be? Because global economy reduces suffering in certain ways, in that we're not having to labor so much, right? So is there some sort of
I'm not sure that's totally true. If you
You're not.
yeah, right,
Or what?
we're not.
I mean,
You're not having to do
Someone is, and still there's a cost that most people can't afford. So I'm not sure if you take all the costs and benefits into account, if that's something that can continue in the same way. If we just go somewhere and spend our money, I think at some point, we're going to have to, if we want to make it affordable for everybody, we're going to have to cook more of the food, or even grow more of the food.
But do you think that's, so the reason I ask this question is, we see a lot of communities, states, nations, cities trying to create intentional communities.
Say what?
Create intentional communities by offering large incentives for, say, the digital nomad community to come to their location and put down some sort of roots. Do you think that the money aspect of it could trigger that if there was enough kind of protocols around that?
It could trigger what?
it could trigger a long, sustainable intentional community, or like what we're talking about here, where like yes, it's using money and the global economy and stuff, but like by using those forces with protocols around it, potentially lead to sustainable long-term.
I don't see it, but I'm not 100% sure. I don't see, it seems to me like, yeah, you could have digital nomads, but they're still using this other thing that is basically not conducive to tribes and villages, and I mean,
So something I have that.
I mean, locally, yes, in some instances, but like in the big picture, it's just,
That's what you're moving between, right? Because he could say, yes, I could create a successful intentional community. And you're saying, no, you're not dismantling this disruptive hierarchical system.
yeah,
Is that right?
something like that. I mean, yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Right.
Like we were basically
I mean, the question is, do you think everybody could be a digital nomad? I don't think so. I think it's
But I don't
available.
think he was proposing a global solution.
No, but sure, yeah, locally, you could have a few communities of digital nomads. I don't see a problem with that.
But if those communities are started by digital nomads, for example, and I'm thinking of some of like towns and villages and stuff that are purposely inviting digital nomads in those communities to try to rebuild these towns, where the digital nomads come in there with families and start to potentially build generational existence and bring back local economies and markets in those areas.
Perhaps, yeah. I don't see why not. That could happen, maybe.
Yeah, it started that. It looks great. That they were for a few years with all these towns were like, you can own this, you can buy this town in Spain for like $20,000 that has like a castle and like a million buildings. And now they're like, actually, you can come here if you're digital nomad and you can be here.
And essentially, that's how cities are built. You have different backgrounds and you offer different services and different goods. The diversity of the families coming into one place. That's how it grows, the local economy, right?
It does seem like it could be a good hybrid because you do need, like, the digital nomads are not usually growing food. So you do need these like hands-on people that are going to make shoes and and then these other people are like bringing in more money than the local laborers usually get. So they're bringing in that money and spending it. So like a hybrid between people that do actual real world physical work and people who are doing local digital stuff would be necessary. Right?
That might be
I mean, is
good.
that like what you're saying? Is it like kind of saying like they're sucking money out of the global economy and putting it into an intentional community?
It was yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
For me, I would say it's like not sucking the money out of the global economy per se, but it's
You're just using the money.
using that money for a very intentional purpose.
But almost a capitalistic redistribution, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the capitalistic side is hard. I mean, it's even with this community here, right? Like, there's a certain point where, let's say like they keep continuing this every year and trying to like make it sustainable. At some point, it is a capital. Like it's a business, right? Like so there is this aspect of like trying to make it sustainable in this global economy. I mean, the hard part is with this. I mean, it's a great conversation, but it's like we are in this global economy, right? We're embedded in it, and there's groups that create these intentional communities that basically isolate themselves from the global community or the global economy.
Not really. Nobody can totally do that.
Yeah, but like that to me also seems problematic, right? Because for me, that's stepping into an alternate reality, or creating an alternate reality and not trying to.
Well, I don't see it though. I think if there was even one community that was able to truly localize and be successful at it, and people were happy, I think it would go viral.
But I think
Like-
there's still that need for many humans to travel, right?
Sure. So you could have a network of these things. Why not? I mean, that's what going viral is. You could have a network all over the world. But yeah, I don't know if it's possible to get at it from being totally a part of the global economy. I do know that a bunch of people in these more local but not totally local intentional communities are starting to think of doing exactly what you're talking about with these towns in Italy or Spain, which is having a community business, which is like inviting digital nomads to come there and pay some rent for being there. But,
No, they go for free because they're not working for the same company. It's not a business, it's like they're have their own businesses.
so they just let them go there for free because
they have money coming in.
They're gonna go to the restaurant.
I see. I see.
They
Well,
care the restaurant, the schools, the
okay.
How is this an individual community? I mean, that's the same thing that happens with industrialization, right?
migration.
And people just migrate.
Is that intentional?
Where's the intention of that?
With what? With
With this
it?
model we're talking about, it seems more the same as industrialization or an intentional community.
Just a migration, it's not. an
People
intentional
migrate to the city,
People migrate away.
because that's where opportunities are.
Many, like most expats are economic migrants.
Right. It may not have this sense of close knit community. I don't know. If you're somewhere out in rural Spain, maybe it could. I'm not sure.
There's a little bit of not commodification, or like there's a commodity element to it too, because the digital nomads coming in and they're the consumers. So they're not really, I mean, they're contributing money, but they're not really contributing anything else. So
Because it seems like there's at least a number of threads that are undermining things. One is whether or not we set these demands that somehow has to be working against this systemically problematic global economy, or working with the economy with which we find ourselves within. You know, do we somehow exploit that for our own community and understanding it as a developmental model that gives it a time?
Yeah, perhaps.
I mean, so the only problem the only thing I'm kind of having a hard time grappling with is, if we're creating intentional communities that are self-sustaining, like, does that create a little bit of exclusivity and only certain types of people can come in, or maybe, you know, how do you account for diversity in that type of community?
Well, I mean, if you want to make it self-sustaining, I would think there's like thousands of different ways to contribute, thousands of specializations.
But I think she's bringing up a really interesting point here about selectivity. Like, we get to pick all of the contributing people, and these, on a social level, what would it look like if there was a certain demographic that was never allowed into any community because they
Or just didn't happen to be culturally like capable at that time to get into it. So it was people intentionally being exclusive. It's just like
Well, why wouldn't they be capable? I
Maybe
mean,
they're
it seems like they'd
mentally
be much more capable if they don't have to spend money. They just have to learn some skills.
What about a
And what if
mentally ill
it's a
person?
skill that is not valued by the group? What if
Yeah,
it's
the
something,
mentally ill
you have something that you could offer to the group that the rest of the group doesn't find value in it?
that's what doesn't work though. Like, you have to work and there's certain things that you, like if you're an artist, you're not gonna be able to just be an Orlean and live there and be an artist. You have to contribute like something that the group wants.
Well, there's 24 hours in a day, so like someone doesn't have to spend all their time on something that's going to contribute. They could have some time set aside for
Well,
their
I
own
have a
personal.
sister who's mentally ill.
Okay, so mental illness is
So I
definitely.
paid for her, she's a free
Right, so
rider.
someone
She's a
has,
free
yes,
rider.
someone has to take that responsibility on.
It's hugely important.
right? Is it, are we,
Yeah, I have a friend that has a son that is on the spectrum and needs services, you know, but he
Wouldn't
would
that
just need
be-
one in the community, and where would the services be?
Well, wouldn't the community
someone has to pay
provide
for
that?
it, right? Either the
It's so
community or.
widespread, that's kind of like a human need, right? So the community would have to provide that service.
For one child? Right.
Well, it wouldn't be just one, if it was if it was a community of 1,000, you would have X number of the population that needs, you know, this kind of service, and then somebody would provide that.
But if there's nobody in the community that can provide that, then how would you?
It's,
You'd
Well,
have
you
to
have to
invite
make
people.
it.
somebody's learning, right? Somebody's buying some books and trying to figure out.
But
that
why would
service.
they? I mean, I guess they're contributing to the community, but
I mean, that's
It's
what we
also- you
humans
have to
do.
make
We're
it a
not,
free
we're not like most other animals. We take care of our young, our elderly, our sick. So that's something important to us. So we need to take that into
If
account.
the optimal number is 150 people, is that what they're saying?
Yeah.
Or it's like, they start to really reduce the amount of diversity we can have.
Well, yeah, I think that's for like a tribe, but I think we need like another level beyond that, which is something that's economically viable, which is probably more than 150 people in city thousands.
And I think it kind of also brings up, like when we study old communities and we're talking a very significant word, intentional. Some of the places where you can see that it falls apart is relational and caring, whether it's about each other in a family unit and not in a tribal unit or Mother Earth. And can you just collect a random group of people and expect that level of care? I think in the world community, we're starting to go, oh, well, I care. I like this person. But in a tribal unit, it's kind of baked in. You know?
Yeah, yeah.
And so intentional is more challenging than biological.
Right.
I really think that's super. I think it could be a cancer. Yeah.
What's that? That's,
Exclusivity, what you contribute to, and you can see how it will run amok very, very quickly.
so wait, what's the problem?
You're gonna have
What's-
these wandering nomads that nobody wants in their community. Or they're just, no, they're wandering like pathological people. Like nobody wants them into their community because they're difficult or awful. You know, if you could imagine people getting kicked out of every community.
But is
Not that we need to get
is this where like family
Yeah,
comes in,
right.
because that's the smaller, right? Because that,
Perhaps, yeah.
right, it's the world.
What if they have no family? What if they just?
But that is kind of it, right? That's why we're saying we can't destroy family.
Hmm.
Because that does answer the question. I paid for my sister, nobody else does.
Mhm.
That's it. All right, guys.
All right.
God, you guys are smart.
Do you think the Zoom people are on there? Just
Oh
like,
shoot! Should we ask them? Go ahead. I'm sure they dropped off. Let's see.
You all you said more than people to be economically viable.
I think so. Yeah.
That is.
Emmanuel's still on. He's still on. Look, we gotta get our video on. Let's get our
That's
video.
not external competition, right?
Wait, what you
No, that's not external.
It's dark here.
That would be an
Let's see.
internal.
We need some light.
Can you make it so you can talk?
You
to us?
see?
To be
Is there a
self-sufficient.
face? Can you see a face?
Right.
So these tribes of
Hold on.
150
Oh, I'm on. Are you on mute? Oh, you guys are on mute.
that existed.
Yeah, we're on mute. Can you hear us?
Easier to do it. There were more
Should we turn the lights on?
Hello.
Let's see. Let's
do it with
stop
this
share. Or I'm not sharing
So,
anymore.
nowadays, and I guess even then they weren't. It was still. You know,
Okay, stop sharing. There you are.
Aw.
Hey, you guys.
Oh, hi.
It's very interesting.
That's a really interesting discussion.
She didn't realize where you are.
How are you guys doing?
We are good.
Really good.
We are good. We were commenting and giving our own impressions and own feedback, but it's not going to be recorded, this one. So, no, but one thing I think at the end, what was interesting, and maybe we can share some of the